I want to introduce Rich Davis, who is really interesting. Not a trained archaeologist, but sort of fell into it and has been doing it for over 25 years along with his wife, Linda. And so I hope he'll be able to speak maybe a little bit about how did he become an archaeologist? How did he get into this? He said it started off with just volunteering with the Forest Service and some archaeology work they've been doing. And then they spent time down in Arizona, 6 months of the year, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
For a while. And got involved down there. And we're actually site stewards. I don't remember what the term is, but site stewards of some archaeological sites down there, which won some awards. With the Interpretive Center, he has served as a board member, and he serves as our archaeological advisor, which is a hugely important role. And he's heading up the Methow Archaeological Research Project. And thank you, Rich, for your presentation tonight.
Well, welcome everybody. Can everyone in the back here? A lot of times when you talk about archaeology, people's eyes kind of glaze over, and so I'd like to see somebody lock the doors so nobody can escape. I'm going to start out tonight, and forgive me, I'm going to read something that I wrote because I think I can say it better that way than trying to be like David with a loud and great voice and good delivery. So I'll start right here, and many of us feel passionate about and a connection to this valley that goes beyond explanation, a feeling of what some might define as spiritual, but at least defies logical explanation. Is it the beauty, wildness, the great diversity of outdoor activities, or is it something deeper? If you walk alone and silently in the hills and mountains, sit by a river or a quiet lake, there is power and emotion in the solitude. Is it possible that this indefinable emotion can be connected to the over 10,000 years of other humans walking over this same ground, finding a full and happy existence here? Thousands of people living, loving, dying in this place. I like to imagine there is more than a little truth to that idea. This evening, I would like to direct our conversation toward that premise, to establish the fact that we exist on a land where for more than 100 centuries, people lived in a simple life of hunting and gathering, trading and traveling, lives that left almost no current evidence of their passing. They were what I would call light on the land. If any one of us returned to the place of our ancestors' birth, we would likely feel the need to recapture the history and lifeways of those people we descended from. The Methow Valley Interpretive Center and its Methow Artifact Research Project, in its attempt to satisfy any need by the displaced Methow people to reconnect to this valley and their unwritten past. This building, its contents and garden are dedicated to them. It is hoped that they will find some value in that. It is a fact that there has been little or no formal archaeology done in the Methow Valley itself. Yes, at the mouth, when Wells Dam was determined to be built, there was a village that was excavated there. However, some anthropological and valuable historical work has been done and recently published, but to our knowledge, no archaeology directed at prehistoric occupation and certainly no published records of any research have been done. My wife and I live on the Methow River. We look out our windows at an ancient crossing at a crossroads of several important trails. These trails represent entries into the Methow Valley, trails of trade, valley access, and mountain coastal contact, long before the trappers, explorers, then miners and homesteaders entered the valley and used these same trails. People fished and gathered, where today we do the same. Pretty cool to sit by a small stream that flows through the land we are blessed to live on, imagining all the lives that passed through before. In fact, we have found artifacts on our land that can be dated to 6,000 to 9,000 years before present. Downriver, a short distance, a projectile point that probably dates to 9,000 to 10,000 years before present. And within a few short miles, projectile points that date to over 10,000 years before present. Well, first of all, I'd like to just show you this because it's pretty dramatic to see that the blue line represents somewhere over 10,000 years. And the red line is the time since contact of the Europeans. And you can see there were people here that whole span of time. We don't know that they were here every minute and every year during that 10,000 years, but they were here probably most of that time. And that little line down below represents the time of European contact, but also the time that those people that lived here were either driven out, died from disease, all kinds of reasons, and their numbers were diminished down to the very few that are existing today. This is another chart that I've used before, and this represents that over 10,000 years. And there are various phases that we used to determine the time periods that are represented by the various styles of projectile points. And actually the time, the post-contact time is so small that it almost isn't represented here. The Methow Valley was once home to thousands of people, and where did they go? Several hundreds of years of imported diseases decimated the existing population, and the few people that remained were forcibly removed. So thinking about the thousands of people that were here over thousands of years, where did all the evidence go? We're not seeing much around. Well, that can be answered with several things, and one is that most of what they used was received from nature. Their basketry, clothing, all their tools, those things are rotten, gone. There's some rock art here. There might have been a lot more before. So there's some proof that at least during the time or since the time that the rock art was made, the valley was occupied. But we do find groundstone tools. That remains. And if they're recognizable, and we've had a lot of conversations with people that have a question about what they found, if it was really an artifact or not, and that's one of the things that I like to hear because I really like to look at them and record them and photograph them and make that determination. Construction of residence and agriculture is pretty much diminished, even those things. After somebody digs a hole and they disturb that ground, it pretty much removes the ability for someone to identify and find within that pile of dirt any artifacts that might have existed there. Chipstone tools suffer that same fate, and bioturbation by rodents and plants churn up the soil. So if you think of hundreds and thousands of years of gophers and etc., digging around up in the hills and down along the river, everything is just in a constant state of being churned up. And then, of course, there's always the collection of these artifacts by curious people, and major destruction and loss due to flooding, and that's probably what happened to most everything on the valley floor, time after time after time. There were pit houses, there were people hunting and fishing along the shores, gathering along the shores, wherever they lived, has been inundated even within the last even 100 years. At least twice, it would have destroyed any evidence of any of that. So, how do we estimate the age of artifacts and the populations? Well, the first thing we as archaeologists, and when I say archaeologists, we are both avocational archaeologists. We've been highly trained. And we spent years and years and years out in the field doing things that most archaeologists wish they could do. So I can speak from a lot of experience, and one of the ways that we can determine that things have a certain age is by excavation. Now, excavation is something that's hardly ever been done in this valley, and it probably never will be, or unlikely that it ever will be because of changing laws, rules, and etc. So when you're able to do this, wherever you might do it, as an archaeologist, it's thrilling, wouldn't you say? It's just amazing to start going down through the soil very carefully, screening the dirt and finding these various articles. And when you do an excavation, you create a profile, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. But that edge represents a profile, and pitch over to the side, and so does this. And so you can see in the photograph that the top was sterile soil, and then there was a little bit of something in the next layer, probably historical stuff. Just maybe it was a farmstead, and there were some things left from the farmer. And then maybe a flood occurred after the fourth layer, and left a layer of sterile soil, and then you can see all the charcoal. That's what we look for, because that's datable material. So when you see the charcoal and you find items in it, like arrowheads particularly, and you can date that charcoal and you can say that that arrowhead came from that time, at least pretty much, be sure of it. If you find several places like that and they all date to the same thing, then you're pretty sure that that arrowhead can be identified along with that date to be from a specific time in the past. And then below that, again, I won't go too far with this, but there was obviously another layer where there were more artifacts, and they probably dated to an even earlier time. In doing all the research that I do, and it's hundreds of hours, I think Linda will testify, it's very difficult to find anything on the Methow Valley. But we think that the Methow Valley and its population pre-contact was pretty much the same as far as the lifeways and the tools and so on that they used as the rest of the north central Columbia Plateau. A few years ago, there was a excavation done on the Columbia River below Vantage, and they found a particular style of projectile point, almost unknown in the Northwest. Beyond that, it was the only place in the Northwest that these projectile points have ever been able to get positive radiocarbon dates based on the excavation and so on that they did. So they were able to get an age on those projectile points. Those projectile points are found all over the Great Basin as far as Utah, a little bit in Oregon, and a little further south, not much. So they represent a certain group of people at a certain time. Those projectile points almost do not exist in the state of Washington, maybe in private collections, but other than these, no one's ever been able to date them. But there were other ones found down along the Columbia and Oregon and Idaho, and so they got similar dates for those. And so we can say, based on what I found in this research, and if you pay real close attention to these two right here, based on that research, we have been shown two of these projectile points from this valley. And we can pretty safely say, because somebody established with dates, that those projectile points could be 10,200 years old. That's a pretty good indication of how long this valley has been, if not occupied, at least people were here. These were three more that have been either shown or that we possess. The one on the left, Linda found in our yard, it can date to 9,000 years old. It's a style, a cascade style, and it can be a variant, which mostly are found, that particular Olcott style, mostly found in Western Washington. They're not real rare, but they're fairly rare and certainly very old. The one in the center was found on Texas Creek. And I think I talked about that last year. It's about that large and the most beautiful thing you ever saw. It just takes your breath away when you have it in your hand. It has so much power. The one on the right is down the river from our place in a site that I haven't really shown anybody. I have to find the right person. It's a wind dust point. They do not exist anywhere around here, but there it is down there. And there's a lot of other artifacts there too. And there again, that thing can date to over 10,000 years. What are those people, what were they doing here? Obviously, they were from somewhere else, but they were coming through here 10,000 years ago. It's really a question that needs to be answered. So again, projectile points can reveal and determine the age that a site or an area was occupied. I'm sure you can all read that as well as I can, but each projectile point can represent both a culture, a style, and a chronological period. So when an expert, and I have to say I consider myself kind of an expert, studies that and looks at its morphological attributes, which are just merely all its stylistic characteristics, you can determine the relative age of that artifact. But that, again, can only occur if in some other place somebody has excavated that projectile point with radiocarbon or some other kind of dating method that puts a specific time period on that projectile point. Well, now I'm going to talk a little bit about what David was talking about when he introduced me, our experiences and how we came about becoming avocational archaeologists. we moved to Arizona after volunteering up here several summers for the Forest Service on their projects, doing archaeology, and fell in love with it. And got to this little town in Arizona where there were over 1 million acres of unrecorded desert. Hardly any archaeologists had ever been out there before. There were some small exceptions. Those few that did, with one exception, did a real poor job. It was back in the 40s. They were mostly just collecting arrowheads for museums. So we were able to be trained, highly trained, by going out in the field for all those years into this huge area. And in that area, it's so exciting just to think about it. There are rock shelters that have been occupied. There's hundreds of them, occupied for thousands of years. There were playas, which are just dry lake beds surrounded by ancient campsites that date back to 13 to 15,000 years. There were rock cairns and pictographs, petroglyphs, ancient trails. There were cremation sites where they would cremate piles of bighorn sheep bones, some kind of a ceremonial thing. There were intaglios, which were ground figures that can only be interpreted by seeing them from above. And all kinds of quarries. They had beautiful stone for tools down there because it was a volcanic area. So there were quarries all over that we were recording. And thousands of tools and artifacts and hundreds of thousands of potsherds everywhere we went. So the result of that, as it always should be, are publications. Well, one of the things that we discovered was that the information on the types of projectile points in that area was really scant, and it really didn't necessarily apply to that area because nobody had ever done it before. And adjacent to that 1 million acres is the Tohono O'odham Reservation, which is the second largest, I think, in the United States. You don't do any archaeology on there. They have an archaeologist, but they do not want to have it done there. So except for some really important and rare times, it was never done there. And so we kind of had this all to ourselves. And we worked with a couple of highly respected archaeologists, a couple, who, whatever they did, everybody ran to hear about it, all the other archaeologists, because they were highly respected. And so they encouraged me to write a couple of books about the projectile points, which I did. One was a field manual, and the other one was one for archaeologists. We also spent several summers in Montana excavating an Ice Age cave, and then buffalo jumps, which is another really exciting thing to do. And every year we would then publish something about that. So we had quite a few publications. Another important thing to do after you finish all this work, and a lot of archaeologists either don't do it, don't take the time to do it, or it never gets published, or it certainly never gets to be seen by the public who's interested in this. Part of that, what we saw down in Arizona, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it was so exciting, I just like to talk about it. It was raw desert. There was also some beautiful desert. But this is just raw desert. You couldn't think anybody could survive there, and it would go on for miles. Well, everywhere on the top right, everywhere you would go, or in the Greasewood Flats, would be old roasting pits, campsites, all kinds of signs of fire-cracked rock. And when you'd find a gathering like this, you'd find potsherds, arrowheads, chipstone tools, groundstone tools, and we recorded every single one of those things. And these all were just pictures of a similar type of thing that we'd see there. Each one of them represent, this was on the right, lower right, were trails. There were hundreds of miles of trails across the desert. And in reality, you could say, well, there are cow trails. Well, these were all recorded in history and diaries, etc., as being old Indian trails. And when you go there and you see them, you realize there's no water there for a cow to go to. Those were human trails that had been there for thousands of years, mostly marked by rocks or finding artifacts along the sides of them. Another thing that was exciting was that in the desert, there are water holes. When they have flash floods, etc., over thousands of years, maybe millions, the water tends to just keep digging out these spots, and then the water remains there until animals drink it up. And this was one that's pretty well known, but it doesn't get visited very often, and that's what they look like. They're really cool. You're just going down this wash in the desert, you look over the side, and there's this pool of water where there shouldn't be any. And you just know there are going to be artifacts there. And there are. And below this particular one, just over this side, was a huge rock shelter. This just shows a corner of it. And that's what we would find and I would get all excited about, because you knew that we could see they were occupied. There were artifacts all over the place. Most of them have never been excavated except by just local people that might be scratching around trying to find an arrowhead. So who knows what was under the earth. But some of the arrowheads we would find there would date back many thousands of years. Most of it was ceramic period time, the last 2,000 years. And that would just be all over the place and over the side in what they call the midden. And there were hundreds of these caves, most not this large, but at any rate. Within so many of these rock shelters, and most people wouldn't even see it because you're looking at the ground, you're looking at the smoke on the ceiling, and then you see pictographs. And so many of these had pictographs. Some of them, I didn't bring some pictures of some because I was asked never to show them to anybody, but we were shown pictographs in some caves that would just make your hair stand on end. They were so special, so emotional, and so hidden back in the desert and the mountains. Nowadays, they're getting the science that enables them to date some of the pictographs by the paint and the patina and so on around them, but it's very difficult, and most of these probably nobody's going to have the money to do it. But they're old, very old. This is just the last slide here about this subject, but here again, it applies to what we're trying to do here. We're going out in the desert, we'd camp out overnight, we'd hike a long ways sometimes, had to take a lot of water, or drive on roads you can't believe. And then we would spend all day or several days out there surveying the area. And when we would find sites, then we would just bring out the paperwork. We'd find projector points, and we'd photograph them. We'd take a GPS reading. I love to draw, so I would draw them. And then we would fill out countless forms. We would do field drawings with a GPS just to get the shape, so we'd be able to relate that to each projector point that we took a photograph of. And then this was an excavation, one of several we did that took more paperwork and permits and approvals, and especially by the Tohono O'odham people, to allow us to do that. And it was well worth it. We found things that no one had ever found of an age that no one believed could occur in that area. So that brings us to the Methow Artifact Research Project, which we're conducting here. And I've talked about this before, and some of you might have read about it, but it's an attempt to recapture and create a record of artifacts found in the valley that will enhance the understanding of the pre-contact history of the area. There's been a lot of work done on the history of the valley and both the Native American history and the pioneer history. And the Schaefer Museum takes care of a lot of that. And this museum is dedicated not only to that pre-contact history, but also the present-day Methow people and their story. So in order to back that up and give us something to use to display here, I've asked people to let us bring any artifacts that they might have stored away, or they might think are artifacts, or their grandpa or their neighbor had, and bring them. And I will guarantee privacy, but I cannot proceed with this project unless I have the artifacts that I can photograph and measure and diagnose and research finally. And then we can display at least a photograph of that here in our records. So some people want to retain possession and they do not want their identity revealed. That's fine with me. Other people loan their artifacts here for study and display. And what we really love is when they really donate the artifact so that everyone can enjoy it. So, and then they become part of our exhibits. I'll read the next part because it's really important. The exhibits will present a more extensive view of how we can integrate the cultural pre-contact history of the area with present-day history and natural history. So we have both natural and cultural history. This information can be combined into the Methow tribal descendants' continued ownership of this valley through the reintroduction of their ancient past and displaying their current history and memories. So part of our project has resulted in some very cool donations, and it's led us in more directions than probably ever can be followed. The projectile points, as I emphasized, are the most important thing because we can date them. We can get a real good picture of the past and the age and so on and so forth and what might have gone on wherever those projectile points were found. This was donated by a fellow that lives down by Winthrop. They had a trail clearing thing done there, and he heard about our project and he donated this projectile point. So it's another one of those Cascade variant points, and that can date back to 9,000 years. Okay.
You said a burial point?
No, not we don't even talk about that kind of stuff. No, we don't know anything about burials. We don't want to know anything about burials. Burials are sacred and sensitive, and most of these things were just, they shot it at something and they never found it again. This one was donated about a year or so ago. A fellow found it up on the top of a mountain up by Mazama, and he was great. He did exactly what a person should do. He recorded the GPS reading, the elevation, and the date he found it, and he sent the projectile point to me to study, didn't want it back, and it's here on display. It's just really cool. So I was able to find comparable projectile points that had been dated along the Columbia River, and this one looks like it was about 2,500 to 1,750 before present, which is not real old, but it's real old. So without going into too much detail here, we call everything up until about the time when arrowheads came into use, and nobody really knows that answer, but you can get pretty close, about 1,700 years before present. Before that, they were atlatls, or spears and darts used with atlatls. So they were bigger, they were different in style, they were hafted differently, essentially had a different kind of use. And so this is one example of an atlatl they might have used around here. That one was one that somebody made, but anything probably you would find here would be rotted or decomposed by nature. But here they made a pretty simple one out of a deer leg, and I got a couple of deer legs and photographed them and thought about how much fun it would be to make one, but I never did. So this is just a little bit about our exhibits and about how we hope to meld this pre-contact information into the Methow tribal descendants' continued ownership of this valley so that they can come here and visit their history, their current history, and the memories associated with that. And that would be in the seasons of the people room back there. But they can also come and see the artifacts that represent what their ancestors used here long before recorded history. These exhibits are really important. And what people donate, not just for our project, but to this center, are important for a lot of reasons. One really important reason is that the schools in the state of Washington has been mandated they have to teach about the Native Americans from their local area. And so one of the things that we can do is offer that venue to the teachers, and it's been very popular and satisfying. They can bring their students here and actually see things and have it interpreted, and we are here with them to do that. So the teachers can bring a little sheet that each student has to fill out with questions. We station ourselves around at these various exhibits. Students come through, we talk about the exhibits, already knowing what they're going to be asked, and then they have to fill this in. That's part of their assignment. But it's a great way for that situation to occur, and it's the only way that I know of. One of the other things that our research is doing is contributing to the archaeology of the North Central Plateau, the Columbia Plateau, and that is, again, because no one's ever done that in this valley. There have been very few archaeological. Sure, every project is supposed to have an archaeologist review it and look at the ground. I know how that goes. I mean, I respect all these people, but it's better if they don't find anything and the project gets held up. So, and if they do find things and they write it up, it's lost forever to anybody like me or even professionals. It just goes into their files and how do you get at it? Our information is going to be available to anyone who wants it. And we can archive previously unstudied artifacts, and there's a lot of stories and rumors about places and things that have occurred around here, sites and tool acquisition sites and quarries and so on. Well, we can research that and go to those places, find out whether they really exist, find out whether they're just somebody's imagination or if it really happened in the past. We were trying to find these tool acquisition sites. I've located, I'm quite sure, if I wasn't so old, I'd have been there by now, the place where they got the hematite for painting their bodies' clothes pictographs. It's a red ochre type of material. There are other places here where they got the pipestone. There are other places here where they got their material to make their chipstone tools. And the trade routes. A lot of that's been recorded in ways, and I'm trying to get all of that material together that kind of been clobbered up from one source or another, and try and make it into some kind of a map, number one, and also a book that would talk about these routes and how valuable they are. Some of those routes represent roads that are now trying to be closed by certain individuals, and they're historical monuments. They should, I'm getting into an area I probably shouldn't, but nevertheless. And the other, of course, really important thing, again, is the projectile points that we can study and determine the dates. So beginning with the climatic and geologic forces and changes, our exhibits help define the valley's development for the people that arrived soon after the ice receded. This was one of the first things that came to my attention after I announced that I was going to start this project. And this was a cache that was found up on Wolf Creek. The guy wants to retain it, but he's more than willing to have me photograph it and study it whenever I want to. It's fascinating. It was a cache. It was buried in the ground. All these things were together. Obviously, it was somebody's long ago collection of stone that was imported into the valley. None of it's found here locally. And some of these things are actually tools. Others, obviously, he was just going to, or they were, maybe it was a woman, going to make into chipstone tools and save for the future. And each one of those could be used as a tool just the way it is. And these are some of the tools that were, the actual identifiable tools that were in the cache. And the one on the top right was a fairly large thing. I've seen several Clovis caches, and I'm not even going to come close to saying that might be what this is. But the tools that were within the Clovis caches were so much like this that it's just unbelievable. So the other thing that we're trying to study is where a toolstone came from. This valley is starved for toolstone, and that's one of the reasons I believe there aren't more projectile points here. Everything pretty much had to be imported except for this dacite type material right here, which can be found in the river cobbles. And of course, on the right is the groundstone piece. There's plenty of things in the river, rocks and glacially moved rocks that have been used to make all kinds of tools. But the chipstone tool material has to be imported. There's just very little here that is of a quality to make arrowhead scrapers, knives, whatever. This was something that is in our exhibit in a lousy state of condition right now. I need to fix it, but it just shows the stages that are gone through. You take a river cobble of the right material, and let's say it's that dacite type material, and they start working it down into these various tools. Each one of those chips and flakes has a use in itself. Just a tool of convenience. But you learn quickly how to identify when it was done by a person and not by nature. This is another interesting thing that came to our attention. A fellow walked in on a board meeting, a local fellow, and he'd been working on an irrigation project somewhere up in Winthrop. They were down in the ground, he said, about 5 feet when this came out. It's about that long. I think I've got the measurements at home, but what it appears to be is a fossilized bone that has been shaped into a knife. And when you hold it in your hand, you can see that it has been formed into a knife. And so if we could get that to study and find out what kind of bone it was, and we could also date it probably, it would be so cool. But some of those things are kind of out of our control. This is another thing that is probably the most valuable thing I've ever seen personally, and probably the most valuable thing that will ever be found in this valley. It's about 19 inches long, made out of slate. It's a knife, or a slave killer, or a salmon killer, or a ceremonial war knife. There are so few of them around, and so little is known about them. And when I say so few, there are none from around here, or only a couple that might have been found on the Columbia Plateau. There's so few around that there's just no information about them other than rumors. And so they all have these names, whether that represents anything in reality or not. But when you see them, you know that somebody spent a whole lot of time and they really meant something spiritual or mystical to the people that owned them. The few that are known, at least the origin of them are known, are found along the northwest coast. So all the way up into Alaska. Most of them, well, none of them look like this, but some of them look kind of like this. This was made out of slate. Yeah, these are a fairly common item here in the valley. And these aren't to scale, but there are net weights, and there are several kinds of net weights, and we all know, imagine what they were used for, but when they made their hemp nets and stretched them across the river, they needed something to hold the bottom down to the bottom of the river while the top line was stretched out. And the one on the left was, well, it's here. It's about that big. And it was found here in Twisp, and it might have been a canoe anchor. It's really too big for anybody to be wrestling around using for a net weight. This is another really rare item that was donated. It's, again, they weren't made here. No one's ever found any on the north central Columbia Plateau, except in areas where they probably were trading for items from here to the west coast again. And again, they're found along the west coast, southern BC particularly. Another thing that people find here that are sometimes hard to identify, this was not, are these pallets where they would need to grind up some kind of mineral for paint, dyes, whatever. And you can see the red, and it's here, but when you hold it, you can see that there is a red stain in the middle. It was probably where they ground up the hematite into a powder to be used for any kind of decoration. These are pictographs. There are 4 known sites in the Methow Valley that have pictographs. They're pretty amazing when you go to see them. A couple of them, one of them in particular, is pretty difficult to get to right now. I did a lot of research, and I found some information just a few days ago that there's actually another site down the river. And the person who recorded it was back in the 40s, actually has a GPS reading there, or a latitude longitude reading. So I'm going to go down and see if I can find that. It would be a great addition to our record here. There's also a petroglyph here, which is a pecked stone. And we know where it is. It's on private property. We really don't know. I'm not a real aggressive person. And apparently I have a photograph of it when it was face up. It's now face down, and it's too large to move without a piece of machinery, apparently. But I think it's very important that we get some kind of permission from somebody to go in there and tip that back up and take a picture of it at least. But it should be recorded, and its location should be recorded. These are hand mauls. We've had 2 of them donated. One from right here was found right here in town where the Idle a While Motel is. These, you can see the use of them. Again, they were used here. Obviously, there have been several found and more rumors of others, but they were used to split cedar or boards by driving wooden wedges into those boards. That information was handed down from the elders. These are hafted tools. Another thing that there are quite a few of. We're fortunate enough to live in a place that has been occupied for thousands of years, our personal place. And we found several of these kinds of things on our property, digging fence post holes and so on and so forth. They turn up. The one on the left was found downriver in a place we thought was really odd until I did some research. I found out there was an old trail there, an old, probably a miner's trail, but before that it was no doubt a Native American trail. And this was then along that trail, and that explained why it would be so far away from anything or anybody. These are pestles, at least that's what we called them in Arizona. There are a lot of different names for them. In that area, they were used to grind grains and seeds and so on. That probably was the same thing here, but they could have been used for pounding or grinding almost anything. These, I saw this when I was doing research, salmon pounder, what does that mean? So I looked that up, and a lot of the pictures that referred to salmon pounders look like some of the things that we've had donated or been able to photograph here, where they took a piece of rawhide and pounded up the dried salmon, mixed it with fat and berries, dried berries, and that was winter food. In some areas, in the plains, they call it pemmican. I don't know what the name of it. It'd be interesting to know what they call it here. This is something else odd. A fellow brought me quite a few different things that his father apparently had found, and he didn't want to donate any of them. But among the collection of odds and ends of things that they had, nothing too significant except these. And no one can kind of determine, they're so unusual, they're small, whether they were gaming pieces or, but the rock that those brown ones were made of is a local kind of a rock. I mean, you can see it quite often around here. In the Southwest, it's called pitcher stone. But at any rate, who knows? And we really don't have the provenience of those, and there's no record of, nobody's going to give up anything, so we can just guess about it. But they're cool anyway. Okay, another one of the things that we're doing, and this has become a very complicated and strange journey, because first of all, we did a lot of obsidian sourcing because there was a lot of obsidian where we worked in Arizona. And they can source obsidian to the quarry that it came from by its chemical content. And it's a pretty common thing nowadays, but it costs money. And so a fellow donated that particular object up there. It was found up by War Creek. And as soon as I saw that, I said, we have to know where that obsidian came from. It didn't come from there is nothing like that around here. So I just, out of my own pocket, just said, no, let's do this, Linda. And so we sent it down, and it came. Here's the map. They sent along a real extensive map and all kinds of information. It was found in what they call glass buttes in Central Oregon. Okay, another fellow got a hold of me, and he had some obsidian that he'd found up on Beaver Creek. I sent that in. Came from just about exactly the same place. Bob Mierendorf has done a lot of work in the North Cascades. He was an archaeologist and very famous for all of his work. Also found obsidian that sourced to pretty close to that same area. And over in Hamilton on the upper Skagit Reservation, they're doing some work. They also found obsidian that sourced to that same place. So all of a sudden, we've got a trade trail. This stuff came all the way from Oregon all the way over to the coast. And some of it was left here in the valley. Pretty neat. So this is a map that I'm working on now, and it or its partner will be here on exhibit. But what I'm trying to do is show the trade trails as I find them and get them. And they're not real accurate. None of this is real accurate. It's really sensitive information, most of it. But it gives you an idea, and it's pretty hard to see, but I'm putting various colored dots based on whether they're projectile points or chipstone tools or pictograph sites. All these things, we have a key that goes along with this. So when it's all done, it's going to be pretty big, and it's going to be, you can already see wherever there's trade trails, there's all these. This is going to be a trade trail up here or a trail. And that's where all the artifacts are showing up as well. So it's kind of turning out to be very interesting. This is where we live. And that is a rich place, obviously, because all those trails come together right there. And here's just one of the old maps that someone brought me that shows some of these trails. And I'm taking all of these old maps and trying to apply them to the topography now and determine why those trails, pretty obvious, are where they are. And a lot of them were used by the pioneers that first came to the valley because the people that lived here, probably mistakenly, showed them how to get here. So they got here and then they kicked all the people out. These were another thing that we have had donated by the Stokes family. It was really cool. The story is that they were found somewhere up by Winthrop back in the early part of the 19th century or 1900s. And when we acquired these, this is here on display. Both of them are. This has a beaded side on the other side as well. But the one on the right side had 3 projectile points in it. No one knew where they came from. And I looked at them and I don't think they came from around here. So maybe somebody just put their arrowhead collection in that bag, but sometime back there. But it's really a wonderful thing to have those artifacts. This is another thing. A lady donated this basket. I'm trying to get someone at the Burke Memorial Museum in Seattle who's an expert on these things to try and give us an age on it. But the style has been identified as being familiar to the people around here. So it could actually have come from somewhere around here. The lady that donated it claimed she didn't know where it came from, so it didn't help us any except that their donation was great. So again, as I conclude, I want to just push this same thing as how important the projectile points are to this research and to my studies. And if you know of anybody you think you can convince just to let me photograph them or see them or whatever, that would be just wonderful. Thank you.